Welcome to Night Light. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
I hope the dads had a great Father's Day. Happy summer solstice to everyone as well. Sun's going down here in the east, and the longest day is coming to an end, but that means it's a nice setting to hear a few creepy stories. We have a terrific show lined up for you tonight. And we've had many guests like Barlow Ventura talking about her research into mermaids, and Zelia Edgar provided us with many stories from Americana, like the Loveland Frogmen. Jason Gerald's spoken about the giants associated with the Dina and Hopewell cultures. Ken Godsword and Michael Carter have discussed UFOs in the Bible. Joshua Cutchin is our guest tonight, and I think he'll be building on all these earlier shows that have folklore elements to them. And I think he's going to be taking us into some new directions, probably in the second hour of the show, start slowly tying everything together. And I'm just really looking forward to tonight's discussion. Joshua's Thieves in the Night is a book I highly recommend. If you like world folklore, this is a terrific book for you. You can learn more about Joshua by going to his website, joshuacutchin.com. And I'm really glad that our friends at the Three Beards introduced me to Joshua, and it's great to have him on the show. Hi, Joshua. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. That's the nice flip side to it being the solstice is, while I do enjoy summertime, it also signifies the slow creep back towards autumn, which I think we all kind of have a soft spot for, even if the weather doesn't always cooperate. It's always enjoyable. So very happy to be here this evening.
We're glad you're here, and like tomorrow's going to be, just 1 minute shorter, and we're getting closer to the winter solstice, and it's going to be like this time in 6 months. It's going to be like dark, would have already been dark for like 9 hours or something.
Yeah, that's true.
Jeez. So but we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. Learn a lot. Our audience loves this type of material, and we've had like Dr. Alan Hunter, as a guest, talking about, the Grimm brothers and, harrowing situations for children and these creepy villains. It gave us all these interpretations. Hansel and Gretel and Rumpelstiltskin are a couple of the more notable characters. Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream is an imaginary world of the fairies and their influence on humans.
They're some of the world's most pernicious myths, I think. Both both the fairy lore, which you find throughout the entire world. I mean, I think a cogent argument could be made that every population, regardless of where they are, has some sort of body of little people folklore where they often do the same things. They tend to live underground. They tend to be smaller, although generally can shape-shift. They tend to be fond of abducting children, and that's the other really common thing that you see across all sorts of folklore is that constant refrain of, these things like to take children, and they often leave something behind when they do. Not always, but often.
Yeah, you get the Pied Piper of Hamelin's story. Is that more sinister than most people realize? Children following him. Where did they go? We have a lot of interpretations to work through tonight, and I think your book's full of examples from Asia, Iceland, native folklore, South America. I think maybe we just start with some of the traditional Irish, British Islands type stories. Just kind of laid the foundations, and we have a nice sized British and Irish listening audience. This is for them. Get started with them, and we have so many samples to go through. I don't know where to go, but maybe we should just start with a few British examples for our friends across the pond.
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy to. So I guess to sort of unpack all this, and this is probably going to tread some familiar ground for folks, but I'll go ahead and start at sort of the baseline. Our current conception of fairies as these little winged women is relatively inaccurate from a folkloric standpoint. That really originated probably with William Blake or Henry Fuseli. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not exactly when winged fairies appeared, but for the most part, the idea of them as these constantly benevolent, tiny little winged women doesn't really have a precedent in folklore, where they would often be, could be human-sized, but were always, absolute shapeshifters in both in terms of size and shape. And, along with those attributes, as alluded to earlier, a lot of times they tended to live below the ground. And these are motifs that you find, like I said, literally in every inhabited continent, really. But they always seemed to really enjoy taking people, especially the most vulnerable in society, like women and children. So now if we sort of shift our focus to Western Europe, and even more specifically Ireland and the British Isles, you had a pretty robust tradition and belief that, again, was mirrored elsewhere, but just focusing on this region, of the idea that the fairies would often take children to, for various reasons, but they would take children and in their place they would leave behind a changeling. They wouldn't always do this, but sometimes they would. As to the motivations as to why they would want to take women or children, these varied. Sometimes if they were artists or musicians or something, they would be sort of taken as, bond slaves or to provide entertainment to the Fae folk, and sometimes they'd be returned, sometimes not. But there is also a very common theme that you'd find where the fairies would abduct vulnerable people from our population, especially children, because their own race was considered a dying race, and they needed sort of a shot in the arm with some new genetic material, which coincidentally enough is the exact same motivation that a lot of people propose for the human-alien hybrids that we deal with now in UFO literature. But so that was one possible motivation. But to sort of understand some of the other motivations, we have to sort of look at what they would leave behind, that changeling that I mentioned. Changelings were typically, in a lot of the stories from this part of the world, one of three things. They were either a sickly fairy baby, they were either an elderly fairy that was left behind that looked like a baby, or they were some inanimate object, often called a stock or a fetch, oftentimes a log or a piece of wood, that was cloaked in fairy glamour to appear as if it was an animate child. So looking at these three possibilities, we see some of the other motivations for fairy abduction coming to light. It was commonly believed that fairy food was a sham. Time and again, people are offered food in Fairyland, and it turns out that it's been cloaked in glamour, and it's actually like leaves and twigs and worms, etc. So to that end, the milk from fairy mothers was also a sham. So there was this idea that, okay, well, I'll take the human child and I'll leave behind one of our own so that it can actually get some actual nourishment from the human mother. In the cases where there was an elderly fairy left behind in the place of the human child, it was almost sort of like a hospice situation for this elderly fairy to get taken care of. And invariably in these changeling stories, the change is noticed. Again, we're not exclusively talking about children here. There are plenty of changeling stories of adults, sometimes even adult men being taken and replaced. But a lot of these abductions did tend to be of children, and invariably the change would be noticed, and it would be remarked that the child often appeared sickly, would have a small wizened face, might have an oversized head or oversized eyes, again sort of shades of that hybrid lore that we see nowadays in the UFO phenomena, rail-thin limbs, would be constantly in a sour mood, would always be wanting food but would never put on any weight. And these stories tended to resolve themselves in one of two ways. Either the child sort of wasted away and died. There are a few examples from the historical record of changelings surviving into adulthood, although those are exceedingly rare. Or the changeling would be basically abused by the mortal parents. And we can, at some point, if you want to get really dark, we can sort of dig into some of those methods. But the logic behind it was that if it was a fairy infant or an elderly fairy that had been replaced, the idea was that the fairies would see one of their own kind being so horribly mistreated and would whisk in and re-exchange the human child and take their own child back. But a lot of these different methods were really quite inhumane and were doubtlessly visited upon mortal children. So that's sort of the thumbnail sketch of what the changeling phenomena is. The changeling phenomena was not specifically confined strictly to fairies. You find similar motifs with everything from, Asian wild men to New World lake monsters also taking children and substituting them with changelings. So it's sort of like a hallmark of the paranormal in general. But that's the majority of what Thieves in the Night looks at is that sort of suite of phenomena surrounding child abduction.
Yeah. What can you just describe that? When the children come back, it might be pale, have spindly arms, and it almost kind of sounds like like Tiny Tim or something else like that kind of classic British literature that I'm sure all of us have read. But when they do come back, do they report about where they went?
I mean, yeah, you do hear these stories. I mean, oftentimes, so specifically if we're looking at something like the abductions that happened with children, they tended to be infants. This was mostly a risk that happened for children between birth and baptism. That, of course, is a liminal period of life, which is between being born into the human world but not being born, quote unquote, into the church. So that was always a risky time period. So obviously those children didn't really come back. To if they did come back, they didn't come back to share any stories. But you would find stories about children who were abducted more generally and who would come back and would describe a very pastoral scene, sometimes with famous palaces, and sometimes the children would actually save themselves. There's one famous story of a child who was instructed to not drink from who was taken to Fairyland and instructed not to drink from a fountain there, and did, and was actually returned back to where he was because he'd sort of violated that taboo. Other times if you look at, some of the older stories, or stories rather of older people who were abducted, there's a story, very famous Cornish story of a young lady named Anne Jeffreys who was taken away by the fairies, and she heard this. Everything went dark, and she heard this sound like buzzing flies, and she found herself, with the fairies for an extended amount of time, while her, physical body was, if memory serves, while her physical body was sort of in a catatonic state here, which is a fact that, raises some interesting questions about whether these things take place physically or metaphysically. But setting aside that issue, Anne Jeffreys exhibited one of the most common traits that people would after they returned back from these trips to Fairyland, which is that they would become, either a seer or a cunning woman or even sometimes, a straight up, Christian priest. That happens with some children who were recovered from Fairyland. So there's this idea of awakening after returning to Fairyland that very much mirrors sort of the awakening that you see in people who return from near-death experiences, or even, dare I say, some alien abductions as well.
Okay, and the Anne Jeffreys case goes back to 1645?
That sounds right. I can take a look here.
No,
it is 1645.
Page 122.
Yes. Yeah, it is. I believe that was the date. And yeah, she was in, again, lots of times you hear Fairyland is described as being, this absolute paradise with rolling hills, and sometimes the lighting is a little bit dimmer. It's sort of a twilight like the sun. Sometimes there are these, vast shimmering cities or these beautiful palaces that you'll find. And, either it's the sense that you're sort of transported there on a whirlwind, perhaps, like, something you'd see out of Wizard of Oz, or, for the people who happen to stumble into Fairyland, they might sort of find their ways navigating some of the tunnels beneath these ring forts that dot Ireland and the British Isles, and just find themselves, after they've navigated themselves to the end of the tunnel, standing in this other land. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think as we go through the conversation tonight, the Anne Jeffreys story from the mid 17th century, and it's what's approaching 50 years after Shakespeare would have written a Midsummer Night's Dream. But I think you establish. These stories have been around for a while, but you go back even farther to the Turkish one from the 4th century.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to get into Lilith and Moloch, that's Milton had a really vicious portrayal of him in Paradise Lost. That would be just after the Anne Jeffreys story. But we keep seeing these same types of ideas reappearing in that 17th to 18th century time period.
There is an argument that some people like to try to make, and it has some teeth. It does. That that some of these newfound obsessions with child abduction vis-a-vis fairies were expressions of class-based fears that perhaps, members of the lower classes would try to hold children ransom in the upper classes and things like that. These ideas also sort of blended with a lot of what was happening with exploration into Africa. There was sort of a race that was on to try to find the inspiration for the fairies, and a lot of people ended up citing, Congolese pygmies, which was, you read some of these descriptions and they're absolutely horrid because they're, making these comparisons of literal human beings to goblins, and they're saying, oh, these were our goblins, and it's like, yeah, that's just icky. But a lot of these are someone who does a good job of outlining sort of the ickier side of this obsession is Carol Silver in her book Strange and Secret Peoples, I believe it's called. And she does a really good job of sort of peeling all that apart. At the same time, it becomes really hard to say anything definitive about the Fae folk. As my friend Morgan Daimler likes to say, they're the dead unless they're not, and they're they're sometimes this and sometimes not that. They're demoted pagan deities, except in the cases when they aren't. It just seems to be a big collection of different things that, almost like a snowball, just tends to pick up little bits and pieces here over time, which is, one of the reasons why it's not historically indicated that fairies were little people with, wings. But nowadays, modern fairy sightings will often have that. It's almost like the phenomena tends to pick up bits and pieces as it goes. So you had sort of mentioned Shakespeare, and it's interesting. Simon Young, who was another fairy folklorist, said that, prior to the rise of Theosophy in the late 19th century with Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a lot of these communities tended to think about fairies in that sort of relationship with the dead. There are tons of stories with the dead, being around the departed, and tons of stories with you see time and again that a lot of these fairy hills are actually these older burial mounds, and there's that's actually what my next book is about, is exploring all the relationships between our dead to these different types of entities, from fairies to the modern UFO phenomena. But I say that to say that there's also a component of this that also seems like it's perhaps dealing with something which has been with us for a long time that we've always tried to sort of reconcile, which is the idea of, sudden infant death syndrome, or just infant mortality in general. It's still a problem today, and you can only imagine how much of a greater problem it was sometime in antiquity. I'm of the thinking nowadays where it can be two things at once. Like, yes, there can be something genuinely strange going on from a metaphysical perspective, but it can also be something that is, as explicit, or as rational as, like, this is a way that we're trying to cope with the death of children. Looking back to those older mythologies, though, you sort of do have to start with figures like Lilith and Moloch if you're going to talk about child abduction more broadly, and not specifically the changeling folklore. And Lilith was, depending on the Jewish text you read, rather, the version of the Jewish text. That's why I said Jewish. The version of the Jewish text that you read. She's Adam's first wife, and she committed some sort of transgression. In some versions, she refused to lie beneath Adam during intercourse, but whatever it was she did, she was rejected, and God decided to make Eve from Adam's rib. And in a lot of these stories, she was sort of pushed off to the margins, where she became sort of the mother of all demons. There are even, some stories that say that beings like the fairy folk were the progeny of Adam and Eve, and they were so ashamed that they'd been so busy that they actually hid them from God's sight, and that's why they wound up with there. But yeah, I think the earliest description of Lilith was probably in 800 BC, and she herself probably takes inspiration from an avian-footed demon named Lamashtu, which had a lion head that was fond of stealing children, both from the crib and from the womb. Sort of had that ability. And then you find sort of Lilith appearing in other Jewish texts like the Zohar, where she, threatens to go off and take children, and then you also see this conflation that I find really interesting, which is this conflation of Lilith with, black cats. She could often appear as if she was a black cat, and I kind of wonder. I'm not sure if this is where it comes from, and I think I might have looked into it, and it isn't. But I always find it interesting. You've got that old wives' tale about about cats sucking babies' breath from the crib, and I kind of wonder if that's not somehow tied to the Lilith idea as well.
Okay, we're just talking about biblical characters like Lilith and Moloch. You did mention that in the most susceptible period when the children might be taken is between birth and baptism, and in your one story you relate about the Rouse Changeling. That's kind of a creepy one where the mom finds the fairy wedged in a rock, and she beats it with the Bible and gets her baby back. So there we have like all these biblical type stories. Like, was there some kind of confrontation between like the superstitions from the days of yore and the more what was becoming the more prevalent acceptance of Christianity? By the 18th century, you have more the Methodism is appearing in London.
You find time and again this real opposition between fairies and Christianity, to the extent that it kind of gets difficult to separate, demonology and early demonology from a lot of this fairy folklore.
It does seem like they are do get enmeshed in there, and different sects of Christianity are emerging around some of these later times we're talking about. So it is interesting to see what recreate that time and see, understand what people were thinking.
Right, and the reason that I think that polarization emerged was for several reasons. If you adopt the idea that that fairies were a way to conceptualize the dead, well, that doesn't, the idea of the dead roaming the earth technically wouldn't fit into some versions of Christianity, especially the early church idea where, we're all awaiting the second coming. Like there's, to be absent from the body is to be with the Lord or something along those lines. But you also have to look at the idea that, what if fairies were actually demoted pagan deities? And that is clearly the case, especially with some fairy kings and queens, which were obviously deities from this part of, again, in Ireland and the British Isles. They're clearly, something that was once thought of as a god or a goddess. And it makes sense that in that case they would be, sort of set up in opposition to Christianity. Christians themselves oftentimes told the story that the fairies were the beings, the angels, who were, involved in the war in heaven when, Satan rebelled against God, and they were, sometimes you'll hear that they were the ones who were too good for hell and too bad for heaven, or you'll hear the idea that, like, they were the ones who were actively engaged in fighting when the gates of heaven shut, and then they all fell to the earth, and wherever they fell was where they would set up shop, basically, on earth, and, hill fairies and forest fairies and water fairies, wherever the angels happened to land. But you've also got to look at it, too, from the perspective of the church as it got planted throughout, Western Europe. The people who tended to speak of fairies were always these people on the marginalized sides of community. The cunning men, the cunning women were the ones who were saying that they were conversing with spirits, and because of sort of the rigid structures that Christianity had, there wasn't really a lot of room for beings of ambivalence, like they're either demons or angels in Christianity. You kind of get that dichotomy, and there's not a lot of wiggle room.
Yeah, the wheat or chaff. It's one or the other.
Yeah.
There's no there's like what's supposedly no purgatory. There's it's one or the other. No in between. I don't know why Dante wrote Purgatorio. But that's not my.
Well, I mean, there's the idea that even there is the idea that the purgatory might have grown out of an idea of Fairyland, because you find these people who are sort of in this ambivalent state of not being alive but yet not being dead and in heaven, who are seen with the fairies. The number of stories you find of people who see someone who comes back from death and says that they're a fairy, or the number of times people are in Fairyland and they see a dead person, or the number of times people are driving by a fairy fort and they see a neighbor that had died 10 years earlier. Like, those stories are just endless throughout the literature. So there seems to be some indication that maybe Fairyland got conflated with Purgatory, and maybe even to a certain degree was an inspiration for Purgatory, even though I think the case can be better made that Fairyland resembles sort of a shamanic otherworld more than it does the idea of the Christian Purgatory. But yeah, there was this tension that really couldn't be resolved, and I think that idea of remembering that these, by all appearances, were/are free agents, right? I mean, yes, they're malicious fairies, and yes, they're fairies that tend to be benevolent, but above all, you kind of get what you ask for with them. What you bring to the interaction is kind of what you sow and what you reap. So if you're disrespectful, they tend to act negatively, and if you're respectful, you tend to maybe even reap some benefits from that. But that's not something that you find in Christianity, probably, I would imagine, because that implies that you have some sort of influence in the behavior of spirits, which would be awfully close to conjuration. Instead, Satan gets the demons and God gets the angels, and never the twain shall meet.
It's a good way to look at it. So, and we've had a few examples of how, like the Rousey changeling, but how you also provide us with other examples of how children were turned. Let's look at a few examples there. What did the parents have to do to get their children back, other than to drive a spike in the rock and open it up, and there's your child and the fairy. But what are some other ways that parents were able to rescue their children from Fairyland?
Well, there are a lot of different mechanisms by which you could retrieve a child and expel a changeling, and I guess the best way to talk about them is probably on a spectrum from the innocuous to the darker, and we can sort of get into the implications of what those darker stories tell us. But one of the most sort of lighthearted versions is that you would do something absurd, right? And this worked best if the changeling was actually an elderly fairy. And the idea is that you do something so absurd that in all its years, 1,000 years or 900 years that this fairy had lived, right, it had never seen something so absurd. So one of the most common prescriptions, and you find variations of this throughout, Northern and Western Europe, is that you would pour porridge or beer into eggshells and set it by the fire. And the idea was that it would be such a peculiar sight that the fairy, the changeling, which is an elderly fairy in this case, would lean out, its head outside the crib and say, "What are you doing?" And he'd say, I'm brewing beer." And it would say, "Well, I'm older than I saw the acorn before it was an oak, but I've never seen, someone trying to brew beer in eggshells," or something along those lines. And you find variations on this of just doing something absurd to sort of coax it out and just for it to show its hand. So that's one of the more lighthearted sort of folkloric versions. There were also things that were not quite as lighthearted, but were a little bit more, innocuous. What is it? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So there is an aspect of that maybe we can get into later. But short of actually discovering that you could have done something to prevent it, you could also visit your local cunning man or cunning woman, and they would perform a ritual. Or in certain parts, I believe there was the Men and Tollstones, I believe they're called. I believe they're in Cornwall. They might be in Wales, so if I got that wrong, please forgive me, anyone who's listening. I have it right in the book. I just have it wrong in my head. You could pass the children through these holes in these sort of stones, and you could actually sort of, reverse your child. Then it gets a little bit darker from here. You have basically anything that is painful to the child. And again, the idea was that you would be mistreating one of the fairies' kind so roughly that they would be compelled to rush in and rescue one of their own kind. And this could be, cruel but relatively simple, which would be, abandoning the child or exposing it to the elements. That was something that was quite common. To, straight up literal abuse, everything from splashing urine in the face of the child to beating them with sticks and brooms, to, poking their feet with hot pokers, or cutting them, or just basically anything. Literally poisoning them with foxglove. And the idea was that, again, this would be so traumatic that the fairies would come back. This does bring us to probably the most uncomfortable part of the sort of fairy changeling intersection, which is infanticide, the killing of babies, was shockingly common across the world in older times. And if you couple that with the possibility that a lot of medical historians put forth, which is that at least some changeling stories are describing children who are developmentally disabled, then a little bit of a darker picture emerges that I think we sort of have to acknowledge, because I think it's important to acknowledge it. No one has really been able to pin down if changelings were a way to cope with a developmental disability, exactly what condition we're talking about. People have suggested Hunter syndrome and Hurler syndrome, and there's another one that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but they're about, probably about 11 or 12 that I go into in the book, including autism is one thing that gets trotted out nowadays as an explanation for changeling stories. And when you take a look at what that sort of diagnosis, even if they didn't realize it was a diagnosis, what that sort of perception would have meant to someone who is a rural farmer in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, it meant that there would be another mouth to feed that probably would not contribute in any meaningful way around the farm. So that meant that you would basically just kill the child. And to sort of put that in perspective, there's a book called A Most Diabolical Deed by a scholar named Elaine Farrell, and she looks at just the period between 1850 and 1900, and she's looking just at Ireland, and she's looking at just children who are less than 3 years old who were murdered. And during that period, remember, just Ireland, just 50 years, just children less than 3, she found 4,645 cases of children who were murdered, which is just an absolutely shocking statistic. When you consider, for those of us in the States, like Ireland's kind of the size of like Indiana or something. So and this is not, casting aspersions on the culture in general. I mean, this sort of thing happened a lot of places, and it was absolutely horrid. But I think it's important to the memory of those people to sort of see how a lot of changeling lore was used to justify this behavior. Now, returning to something a little bit more along the lines of what we're interested in for tonight, the developmental disability explanation for changelings is only a partial solution, because a lot of the changelings in these stories behave in a manner that no child, developmentally disabled or otherwise, would ever behave. So, and again, in that brewery of eggshells example that I gave,
right.
You're not going to have an infant sit up and speak an entire sentence, right? So that leaves us some wiggle room for the possibility that there indeed was something a little bit stranger going on than just a ways of justifying cruelty to children. So a lot of times this abuse would either deliberately or accidentally kill a human mortal child. If the stories are to be believed, it would sometimes result in the return of a human child that had been taken to the fairies. However, I would like to sort of propose another idea, which I don't think I quite talk about in Thieves in the Night, but I talk about a good deal in my upcoming book, which is the idea that maybe the abuse that was visited upon changelings might have served to induce a dissociative state in these children. And the reason that is important...
Abuse would do that.
Right. And the reason that particular possibility is important is because there are many sort of scholars of the paranormal who have noticed a trend for victims of child abuse to have more often encounters but with the paranormal. Like, it seems to be not like an inviolable prerequisite for encounters with the paranormal, but definitely something that you see in a lot of these cases. And the idea is that children who are subjected to abuse are more likely to enter dissociative states, and dissociative states seem to be a possible vector for encountering a lot of these other realities, for lack of a better term. So the idea that I've kind of been playing with lately is that these children weren't taken to Fairyland by fairies. They were sent to Fairyland by their abusive parents who, beat the snot out of them and made them sort of dissociate and put them in that altered state of consciousness, which seems to be, in a lot of cases, that same sort of altered or other dimension, if you want to call it that, the spirit world, if you want to call it that. But you see that time and again, that dissociative roles, dissociative states of consciousness seem to play a role in contact with, near-death experiences and altered states of consciousness and shamanic initiation and things like that.
Yeah, just and it. I'm talking about where the trauma would cause a dissociative state. You do discuss that even though the child is sitting in the chair, he's away. But he's there. That could be interpreted as just just staring out the window, fantasizing about escaping.
I'm really glad that you brought that up because sometimes these stories speak of being taken by the fairies. In fact, that was just the euphemism they'd use. They just say quote unquote taken with air quotes. Yeah. Sometimes they speak of taken being a physical abduction, but so many times taken was used interchangeably for children or children and women who were there bodily and who seemed to be in a trance or a coma or suffering from consumption or this or that or the other. And a lot of times I think it was either Lady Gregory or Lady Wilde, I can't remember which, but one of these antiquarians, these Irish antiquarians, remarked on the fact that it was very common among the rural Irish to think that this is the changeling, and she has actually been taken physically away, and they left this changeling who's sick in bed behind. But it seems possible to me that we're dealing with that sort of almost like soul theft, and that's what a shamanic culture would call soul theft, or like a spiritual abduction. And this is sort of supported by the fact that in the occasions where someone doesn't actually go to Fairyland to retrieve their child, which is another mechanism that we didn't quite cover, but with the exception of those cases, the actual return of the child is rarely observed. So you can't really say that it wasn't the same child that was just almost possessed in a way, if you want to put it in those terms. But there was a story about a French child who was a changeling and who was restored from Fairyland, and there wasn't a physical child who was brought back. The child just sort of regained consciousness and looked around and said, "Oh, mother, I've been asleep for a really long time." And it's like, okay, so what are we really dealing with here? Are we dealing with something that is more on that soul basis, or is this something more on a physical level?
Well, Sleeping Beauty's lengthy sleep could be considered about the same type of being dormant and becoming an aware adult after unpleasant childhood or something.
Well, I mean, if I recall correctly, wasn't it a poisoned thorn that sent Sleeping Beauty into sleep?
What did that symbolize?
Well, I mean, you can find analogs to fairy thorns, which might be bits of hawthorn or even gorse that you find on these fairy forts that you should never interfere with at all costs, because fairies are very protective of their property, and if you interfered with one of them, you might find yourself harmed or blinded or killed or taken by the fairies. But also the idea that that spirit projectiles of various types, from fairy blast to fairy to elf shot to the fairy stroke, that's where our medical term stroke comes from, was a means of not only possibly sometimes taking people to Fairyland, but also lapsing them to this like comatose state of being taken. So that sort of poisoned thorn that Sleeping Beauty encounters, at least in, I think, the Disney version, if memory serves, could be an expression of that, I think. So that's a very prescient observation.
Yeah, and you mentioned Lady Wilde. Here and go with get involved with another leading Victorian author is Oscar Wilde. His mom was involved in collecting fairy tales, and his dad was a doctor who was kind of looking at real physical cases from his patients and looking at what previous generations may have previous generations may have used for the different illnesses, and your little section on Oscar's parents, it kind of did give me perspective on Oscar's portrait of Dorian Gray, and that's associated with death and illness as well, illness of the soul.
It's interesting because once you start digging into, a lot of this fairy folklore, and again, we're talking about a worldwide body of folklore, but when I say fairy folklore, that's usually shorthand for Western Europe. You start to find that it really has shaped so many of our ideas and our bits of culture here and there. Cobalt, the color cobalt, is named after German fairies that you'd find in a mine, kobolds, It's just little things like that, or like the idea, and then I mentioned that stroke is a variation of fairy stroke.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
And then just the idea that the changeling idea, which you once you see it once, you see it across all sorts of horror literature and fantasy literature and stuff, the idea of the substituted child. I mean, even something as famous as The Exorcist and child possession by demons is kind of a variation on the same idea that whatever's lying in your bed is no longer your child. But yeah, it would be really interesting to have sat in on conversations between Sir William Wilde and Lady Wilde because he seemed to be very much of the opinion that a lot of these, these euphemisms, or rather a lot of these fairy terms were euphemisms for medical terms, and he was trying to sort of catalog them. And I guess we had a doctor and a historian, and together you put those two together and you get a fiction writer, right? But yeah, it would have been interesting to have sat in on some of those conversations.
Yeah, he was a poet too.
Yeah.
Ballad of Reading Jail.
I guess what I'm saying is, like, you get a scientifically minded person, and you get someone who's interested in nonfiction, and you put them together, and you get someone who's more creatively inclined, I guess. Yeah.
Is there a connection with the elementals? Barbara did a show with Jack. That was about a year ago.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a little bit convoluted, and so I guess I should maybe take this moment to sort of explain the way that I understand what's going on here. So nobody knows what fairies were. Oftentimes they were associated with the dead. And then, Theosophy rolls around, and figures like Rudolf Steiner sort of adopted the ideas of the Swiss sort of esotericist Paracelsus, and adopted his ideas, his model of elementals, and sort of started applying those to a lot of fairy lore. So you'd have things like sylphs, who were more of the air, and undines, which were of the water, I think, and salamanders, which were of fire, and gnomes, which were of the earth. And that's where we get a lot of these ideas of fairies being stewards of nature. That's where those ideas really sort of took root and have remained to this day, where people tend to think of fairies as being sort of nature spirits. Having said that, I know there's some people who are saying, well, they are nature spirits, darn it, and I get that. It's not quite that clean cut, because again, we're dealing with fairy folklore, and nothing is ever that clean cut, right? So no, it's not a theosophical invention, but it's not as authentic as some people would like to have you believe, because you can see the idea of fairies as nature elementals sort of flirted with in Shakespeare's work, which is obviously pre-Blavatsky. And you can also see, allusions to it in the fact that a lot of these were, genus loci, and were spirits of the land who literally seemed to like be inhabiting, trees and whatnot. Things like dryads, right, which quickly became folded into fairy folklore on their own, were tree spirits. So the idea that they would be sort of nurturing the landscape makes perfect sense. But it's also interesting to see that if you think about the way that people thought about the fairies being associated with the dead, there's also an avenue that the dead could become fertility and nature spirits. I mean, it was very common to, in parts of, Scandinavia, for example, to bury the skull of an ancestor beneath the field that you want to sow for the harvest, because there's this idea that they sort of are serving as guardians for life to perpetuate. And even among, certain what we would call animistic societies, but, the classical shamanic societies of, that sort of Eurasian region, it was very common to take someone who was a chieftain or a shaman or a warrior, someone who was really respected by the tribe, and to bury them at a very special location. And there seems to be some indication that they, over time, the memory of that person as a human being would fade away and slowly get replaced with the idea of this sort of spirit of the land that was at that specific place. So it's almost as if there's a mechanism for the human dead to sort of evolve into a nature spirit. So again, not a lot of clear answers, but there definitely seems to be those two things that perhaps that's what Steiner was drawing on when he really codified it through that sort of Paracelsian model that has us perpetuating the idea of fairies as nature spirits to this day.
Okay, and just looking at my notes as you're talking about the elementals, and that was really interesting. But and another medical term that could be used to have a greater understanding of what people were thinking at the time. Just to go back briefly, you had a really interesting section on crib creepers and how that might be related to scarlet fever, and leading to the really heartbreaking cases like Sid's case.
Mm-hmm.
But that I thought that was another well done section you had, that it incorporates science and modern terms we understand, but people maybe 150 years ago really didn't quite understand.
Yeah, it's interesting because, when you start, so I kind of just wanted to write a book about changelings because there wasn't really in my opinion, comprehensive look at the changeling phenomena that was both in print and in English. Like there's a German text called Der Wechselbalg, which was apparently like sort of the go-to text. But I'm like, okay, so let's look at this. But once you start peeling that onion, as I find every time I work on a project like this, you find things that you kind of have to talk about in addition to that. So you can't just talk about changelings without talking about just supernatural child abduction in general, and you can't talk about that without talking about what I ended up dubbing, the crib creepers, which are like these things that are seen around cribs that don't ever really take them, but they sometimes accompany children who, might suffer from some sort of intense fever or illness slightly there afterwards. And that really is a motif that you find a lot of times where a nurse or something will wake up and will see, a child. There was a story that I provide in the book was that King Charles I of England was apparently a very, very peevish infant. And this was attributed to one night that he was, as an infant, he was crying. And his nurse alerted his father, King James, And then the nurse told James that she saw this this sort of being that was like an old man, and he threw a cloak over the child's cradle, and it was almost like as if he'd, taken the child away, but he wasn't taken away. So it's like, well, was he a changeling or not? So
Right.
You find stories like that from time to time. There's one that didn't make it into this book, but a recent example, I think it was from like the 90s, in Georgia, where there was a father who awoke in the middle of the night, and he saw, the Hat Man, the classic Hat Man that we talk about in a lot of these paranormal realms, right. The shadow person of the Hat Man, beside his son's cradle. And as he got up, the Hat Man vanished, and he was kind of freaked out, but he went to sleep, and he dreamed that his son would be shot in the head. And, he woke up the next morning and told his wife about it, and she was like, well, that's kind of freaky, but, it was just a dream, don't worry about it. And then a couple of days later, he was returning home from work, and, he drives up to his front, his front yard, and there's his wife sitting, with the child in the front yard, cradling his head, and he wasn't shot, but he was suffering from, like, an intense, like 104-degree temperature or something like that. So you do find these stories still manifesting themselves, like these figures around children at night being sort of harbingers of some sort of dark times to come that are usually related to their health.
Is the Anne Jeffries case another example of when she returned, from her abduction, that she had the special ability of prophesizing?
Yeah, she became quite well known, more I think for a little bit of almost like in sort of a helpful capacity. Like she was really known for like the healing touch and things like that. But that's something that you see time and again. Like there was even, I think there was a story that I talked about in the book where a mother, and I believe it was Ireland. Again, some of the details I might be getting it wrong because I don't have it pulled up right here in front of me. But a mother who awoke in the middle of the night and tried to wake her husband after she noticed that her child was being taken across the room by the fairies who were going to take him to Fairyland. And she couldn't wake up her husband, which is a motif that you see across all paranormal phenomena, but especially alien abductions where, someone, the spouse remains asleep while the other person is abducted.
Michael Carter's spoken about that about every time he's been a guest.
Yeah, I think it's one of those really interesting undiscussed things that you see time and again. And I found that actually happening plenty of times in Bigfoot stories as well, of all things. But in this particular story, she's able to get up and she wrestles the child away from the fairies, and that child grows up to be, a priest. And that's, I know that a lot of people might not be on the same wavelength that I am in terms of a lot of these phenomena, at the very least being similar, if not being the same. But I have to say that, this idea of children coming back from Fairyland and being seers and clairvoyants or becoming, priests and holy men is very congruent with what you see in the, it's very congruent with what you see in the near-death experience. Lots of times people will come back. There are tales of atheists who become ministers after having a near-death experience. And very congruent with what you find in the alien abduction experience as well. People will, suddenly decide that they're Reiki healers, or they'll actually be healers themselves. And, to a lesser degree, obviously that's the case with shamanic initiation, right? Like that's the entire point, is to make you into a holy person. So it kind of makes me wonder if we're not dealing with, sort of manifestations of the same mechanism here, just interpreted differently according to culture. And to that end, I don't think that any culture really has a monopoly on the truth of the matter. Like, is it fairies? Is it aliens? Is it the spirit world? Is it is it something entirely different? I don't know, but it does seem like they're all sort of describing similar phenomena for sure.
When Michael Carter was a guest in October or so, he to talk about his book Initiation. He described many of the traits of abductees, and this sudden interest in stopping reading Mad Magazine, and you start reading like comparative world religion type book. It's like abruptly telling your wife, "I'm going to leave my job as podcaster and become a minister." That's very common.
I mean, it's
Kathleen Martin says similar things too. Interactions with the paranormal might actually cause people to feel compelled to call on whatever your higher power is to help you if you're being abducted or confronting some bad spirit.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of go back and forth. I think it's possible that it could be a conscious, or even a subconscious, way to protect yourself from future encounters, or just, because you're interested in these things now that you know that they're real. But sometimes I also wonder if there's not literally some sort of transformative aspect that's embedded in the experience. I think of... if you look at a lot of the folks who became seers in classical mythology, especially Greek mythology, they were the ones who were able to pass through the afterlife and reincarnate without drinking lethe, the drink of forgetfulness. And so they were in the other world, and they retained the memory of being there, and from that they got their powers of precognition and healing and wisdom, and that's sort of what you see in a lot of these experiences too, is that people come back from these experiences who retain memory of it are the ones who tend to sort of reap those benefits, which of course begs the question how often these things actually happen to us and we don't remember it, I guess.
You just mentioned the Greek philosophers. You can also look at the right there at the beginning of the book of Acts, where Jesus is talking to Peter, a couple of the apostles, and then the first or second chapter says, and then our Lord got called up to the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what they just witnessed helped them to be, like the seers that you just mentioned. That's pretty supernatural event, but they obviously in the book of Acts, they're starting a ministry is kind of like what you just mentioned, new vision, new purpose.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, it's always interesting to me whenever I talk to, I am a Christian myself. I would qualify myself as, sort of a Christian animist or a mystic Christian or just a weirdo Christian, but I am still a Christian myself, with just a very robust spirit ecology worldview, I guess. But I always find it interesting whenever I encounter people who are, Christians who say that they don't believe in the supernatural because they believe in the Bible, and it's like, well, that's the most supernatural book there is. It's like, mm-hmm. It really is. It really is. Yeah. And it's interesting. I think that a lot of people don't quite realize that, but that's my take on it.
It's also a super creepy and scary book.
Yes, I mean, yeah. If that's the thing that the other thing I don't think a lot of people believe is that I actually had a friend of, not a friend of mine. I had a family member who was practicing minister, Baptist minister, and he was working with a church in the Midwest, and he came to me and he said, we had somebody came to me and talked to me about their house being haunted, and he said, I'll be darned. There was something to it. Like, this guy was super authentic. We went there, and there was just some odd things that happened. And I looked him in the eye because, this is Southern Baptist, preacher, not one to acknowledge the existence of hauntings or something
Right.
on Earth. That's not strong in the Southern Baptist tradition. And I said to him, I said, that's the funny thing about it. A lot of people want to look at the Bible and say, a lot of metaphors in here. I said, but sometimes they're not metaphors. Sometimes it's
Actual history.
Yeah, it's actual history, and but also that sort of spiritual warfare thing. I think we always want to extrapolate and say that, it's the greed inside you, or it's the evil inside of you, or it's the temptation inside of you. But no, sometimes it's quite external and quite tangible, I think. Knock on wood, I haven't encountered that firsthand too many times, but I do think that that's something that's out there for sure.
Yeah, I had a aunt visiting my parents, and I happened to be there, and she's asking me, what are you doing now? And I told her I work with Barbara, and she's like, oh, really? And she told her, you can go to BarbaraDeLong.com and look at, and I think she read the caption to Wallace when Wallace Wagner was a guest. That could give you a more precise date. And his book was about basically UFOs in the Bible, and I think she heard about a minute or so of it, or she's read the caption. She's like bookmarked it and listened to it later, and she just looked at me and was like, "Don't you believe in God?" And
yeah,
I've had the same thing, and I was like, for these shows, I probably read the Bible as much as minister preparing for a 20-minute lecture on Sunday. You wouldn't believe how much over the last 2 years people are sending us books on a biblical mystery. They think they have an explanation for David Brody and all the treasures from the Temple of Solomon or something like that. I'm going back to the books and reading his book, as well as making sure that all that stuff is that really mentioned in there? Right? There is. David says, and Exodus, whatever. That's where you find it. There it is.
Yeah, it's. I've run into that exact same resistance myself. My folks were talking about what I do, and to somebody, some sort of friend, they said, well, isn't Josh a Christian? And she's like, yes, I don't see why these things are mutually exclusive. And that's the irony that I run into, is that a lot of the people who have that reaction, like, I thought you were this, or I thought you believed in God, even if they want to apply something that, but they it's like, you do realize that the people, I'm trying to think of a way to accurately and perhaps less offensively articulate this, but so there are a lot of people who are obsessed with burn marks in the ground and what sort of propulsion systems are on the UFOs and all that stuff. But having said that, most of the people that are in my circle of friends that are interested in the UFO topic think about things like God and the meaning of life and these deep topics. They're deep thinkers, and they think about it more than anybody else that I know, and honestly, probably more than a lot of church-going people that I've been around in my church life, and I think it really is, it does them a disservice to just assume that they're, living in their heads with sci-fi fantasies when they're actually some of the more thoughtful people that I've encountered regarding this stuff.
Yeah, we try to be comprehensive on the show, and just at least still try to present a uplifting view, from just a variety of points of view. But we don't, just because you talk about, it's like we don't dwell on all these. You only get one aspect of the paranormal, but there can be a faith-building aspect to doing these shows if you do them right. It's like sit there and just talk about the scratches on my back,
right.
walking down the dark hallway, and so some of that becomes more like the Cartman version of paranormal investigation. Oh, it feels hot water running down my leg, and they run out of the
right.
Okay, now we probably just lost a bunch of listeners, but
well, I mean, yeah. So I think that any endeavor like this can be your own personal alchemy if you treat it the right way. So it sounds like you're doing that. Sorry, folks, if we've got a little bit far afield, but in my experience, these are the most meaningful conversations that you have. So I appreciate it. But yeah.
But okay, so we've covered a lot of over 77 minutes of our rant. We've covered a lot of Western European stories. Do note that Asia has some pretty similar type abduction type story. I'm just kind of going to the point of we find these types of stories all around the world.
Yeah, that's the thing that a lot of times when I talk about fairy lore, I'm talking about that again, Western Europe, Germany, France, Scandinavia, Ireland, and the British Isles. But I can't. Some of the stories, for example, that you find in the New World, are so striking that in their resemblance to old world fairy legends that either they're describing something objectively real or there's some sort of cultural contamination. And I haven't seen a super strong case for cultural contamination yet. So I think that there really is something that a lot of these different cultures sort of arrived at independently. But yeah, I mean, again, in Asia, there were spirits known as the Tengu, which were sometimes, this sort of half bird, half, humanoid sort of spirit forms. And, you read these stories and they often tend to sound like, a lot of these UFO stories or these fairy stories. So, fairies would sometimes entice people into their dancing ring as they were dancing, in the twilight. And sometimes these Tengu, and there's one story that I recorded that there was a child who watched the Tengus dancing, and something that looked like a net descended from the sky and drew itself around the dances, and from the meshes of the net shot out these flames. And the Tengu took the child with them before dropping him back home on his roof. And he was, in sort of a daze when the priests found him. So it sounds quite a great deal like both alien abductions and a lot of these fairy modalities as well.
Okay, and you just mentioned this possible Asian abduction, or it could be interpreted as an example of a UFO abduction from Asia. Okay, you have the Zimbabwe case where there were 62 school children between the ages of 5 and 12 that saw a fleet of UFOs, and this was only about 30 years ago. So
this is
what's so we just went from an abduction case to a mass sighting, which would might be similar to the Phoenix Lights case.
Yeah, well, there's a new documentary out about this. I think it's just called Ariel. But this is the Ariel school case from Ruo, Zimbabwe, and you've got all these children who were staring in the sky, looking at, I think, 5 craft or something like that. And there were some landings and some conversations that happened between them, if memory serves. So this isn't an example of child abduction per se, but it's another example of children being the ones who are sort of the focus of these beings, and it's such a persistent motif, the idea that children are the ones who most often run into fairies, and the idea that alien abductions begin in childhood. Is just really fascinating to me because it just keeps coming up over and over and over again. And what I found really interesting was that if you sort of adjust for our culture's ideas of where adulthood begins, it's almost as if the phenomena recontextualized its standards as well. let me explain this a little bit. So again, I don't think that the fairy lore is the correct reading of the phenomena. I don't think that the UFO lore is the correct reading of the phenomena. I don't know what is, but I think that they're describing the same phenomena. And I also think that whatever this phenomenon is, I think that it recontextualizes itself to keep up with our cultural expectations and appear more convincing to us, right? And if you look at when children tend to be abducted the most often, as alien abductees, this is not a hard and fast rule, but you can say that they tend to focus more on younger people, with teenagers and young adults being the most vulnerable. And there's sort of a peak in the 20s, and they kind of tend to decline and then drop off pretty sharply after your 40s. At least that was the trend that Eddy Bullard noticed in the 80s when he compiled his masterwork of UFO Abductions, Measure of a Mystery. And it's interesting that if you look at sort of the modern West, where we sort of place adulthood, it's kind of between 18 and 21, right? It's kind of where we've all agreed that adulthood lies. Right. But if you looked at sort of like that same window when you were becoming an adult in the British Isles, it was between 12 and 14. So in both examples, you have the sort of window for abduction of roughly like 14 years that remains intact. Alien abduction seems to mostly take place between 7 and 21. Again, mostly, like that's when you have the heaviest contact. Right. And fairy abduction was like 0 to 14, because you don't get a lot of like infant abduction stories in the UFO lore. But it seems like as our standards of adulthood shifted later, the time frame for the abduction by the other also shifted as well to accommodate that. And I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and Hawaii had a similar mass sighting about 50 years earlier with more school students.
Is that right? I don't remember that.
Yeah.
Let me look at it. Yeah.
About page 180 or so.
Yeah, I think I do see that. Yeah, so that was I think part of the reason I didn't quite remember this was that this was a So the sighting of not necessarily UFO craft, but it was a sighting of Menehune.
Okay.
Which are the
people.
Yeah, exactly. And this was about 45 children and a school superintendent, and it was from the 1940s, where they supposedly saw the Menehune dancing across the street. The Menehune are really interesting because you can draw some interesting comparisons between one of their associated spirits and some other phenomena that are related to UFOs, like the Wild Hunt, like the Night Marchers, or these sort of ancestral Polynesian warriors that are not the Menehune, but they're kind of, loosely related and loosely affiliated in some way, and they have a lot of similarities that sound not only like the trooping fairies of Ireland and the British Isles that are always wandering and marching across the landscape, but also fascinatingly enough, some of the missing 411 stuff that David Paulides talks about, where people are found with their clothes off, face down. Well, that was the way to protect yourself from the Night Marchers, was to strip naked and make yourself humble before them if you happen to encounter them in the late evening. But also in a strange echo, and it's one of those things like, why does this similarity exist? The Night Marchers were often preceded by another spirit that would tell people to watch out, that the Night Marchers were coming and that you had best make way. And you see that exact same thing in some German legends about the Wild Hunt, the Ride of Odin or the Ride of the Dead that would sort of tear across Europe. There would be this character called the Eckhart, which was sort of maybe a guy who was trapped in purgatory or a spirit himself, but he would do the same thing. He would say, make way, go inside, the Wild Hunt's about to come. So it's an interesting, that herald, the idea of the herald that precedes it is interesting. And then from there you can draw comparisons to between the Wild Hunt and UFOs as well.
Okay, and another example I mentioned at the beginning, and I did want to come back, before, we have about 33 minutes left, but I just didn't want to forget it. I thought it was a really interesting case of an early UFO documentation was the Saint Onofris from the 4th century Egypt, and that one's about contemporary with the Turkish. One of the earliest ones you have in your book.
That's right. And I sort of got distracted by something else. I didn't mention the Turkish one, but the Turkish abduction that you're referring to was there was a historian by the name of Nicephorus who reported that just after this gigantic earthquake in Constantinople, they had gathered into the countryside for prayer, and supposedly this was like 1,600 years ago, this child was pulled straight up into the air and then was returned back to Earth just as quickly as it had been taken up. And this was supposedly the work of angels, but it sounds very similar to some poltergeist infestations from the early 18th century, where children would be sort of dangled in midair in front of witnesses as well. Now, the Saint Onofrius legend was that it speaks to the fact that, again, these children, when they return, are oftentimes sort of given special abilities, or they're sort of set on the path to become a holy person. So Saint Onofrius was a 4th century hermit, predominantly in the Roman and Eastern Catholic churches. You'll find him today. But he was supposedly the son of a pagan ruler, or who was the son of a nomad chief, who was born while his father was away at war. And once he returned, he decided to test his child's legitimacy using fire. Like some people say this is actually where it may or may not be, but like where the term trial by fire comes from, right?
Oh, okay.
So he decided to see if he could burn the child, and if the child, he decided that for whatever reason he decided that if the child was his, it wouldn't be burned, and his child survived. So there's some changeling themes that you'll find in there. But you'll also find some changeling themes with other saints as well, who were supposedly taken and returned, or you find this in other saints' stories as well.
Oh, there's the Saint Guinefort.
Saint Guinefort. Yes, this is a great. Yeah. This is a great story. And
I like that. While we're talking about saints, I was like, we got to talk about that one.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's this sort of strange preoccupation that Catholicism has with cynocephalic saints. You'll find, for example, St. Christopher sometimes has a dog head, and St. Guinefort is probably an expression of that same belief. And the reason that St. Guinefort is sort of germane to the conversation of changelings and whatnot is because he was a dog, was actually called upon to help with as a means of magic to retrieve your child if it was taken away by the fairies. But the Saint Guinefort legend, which you'll find, somebody I heard on a podcast mention this exact same story by a different name, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's a story that you'll hear a couple different places. But in this version, it is from France, and I believe it's near the Chalaronne River is where this story originated, I think. But it's a knight came home, and he finds, the nursery is just absolutely torn apart, and his infant cannot be found anywhere. But his dog, his faithful dog, Guinefort, has its muzzle bloody, and he is enraged, and he kills the dog because he's assumed that the dog has killed his child, right? And as it turns out, he finds that the child has been hidden underneath the crib, and a dead snake is beside the crib as well. So he actually killed the dog that defended and saved his child. So in some stories, it's a thief or something that had entered the home. But supposedly in this story, he erected a shrine to Guinefort, and ever since the 13th century, the dog became something of a folk saint, so not an officially canonized saint within the church, but a folk saint. And along with that sort of extra power to the laity, Guinefort could also restore changelings. So if someone found that their child had been abducted by the fairies and the changeling had been put in its place, you could offer Guinefort salt at the site of this shrine. You could hang the child's clothes on some bushes, drive a needle into a tree, which might speak to the fairy fear of iron. Then pass the changeling between two specific tree trunks, toss it in the air 9 times between a mother and a magic woman, and then asking the fairies to bring it back. And then you'd lay the changeling near a tree and light 2 candles. It was a whole ordeal, as you can tell. Light 2 candles and wait for it to burn, and then then you dunk it in the river 9 times, and you've got your child back. And again, that's one of the more benevolent ways to restore your child if you suspect a changeling is involved.
Yeah, with just getting your child back in the example you just concluded. You spoke a little bit about the changes that the children or experiencers have after the event. But how much do these changes in children seem to correspond with traits of the indigo children?
Well, I think that So I have this idea that I play with, and I think that it's a kind of an interesting way to look at some of these phenomena. So in his book that has been a large influence upon me, called Demonic Reality, Patrick Harper mentions that the fairies, because you have these stories of the exodus of the fairies, but they're always leaving because Christianity is driving them out or scientific revolution is driving them out, and the fairies are leaving. And Patrick Harper says, the fairies are always leaving, but never gone. And meanwhile, ufologists assure us that the aliens are always coming, but they're never here. And I thought, that's not only an elegant poetic statement, sort of showing how the two phenomena express the same ideas in different ways, but you could also sort of apply that same principle, that it's the same idea but sort of inverted to other aspects that are shared between the phenomena. And the example that I like to use, if anybody out there is a musician, because I'm a classically trained musician myself, is that if you have two pitches, a concert A sounding above a concert C, that's a major sixth. But if you invert that relationship and have the C sounding above the A, well, that's a minor third. And these are not fungible intervals. Like, they're not the same interval, speaking in terms of music theory, but they have the same components. So that's what I use as sort of a metaphor to say that inversion sometimes means representation, by which I mean that, like, something can be the exact opposite of something, but still be an expression of the same ideas. And I think that indigo children or star children can be, a sort of an inversion of those ideas. And what I mean by saying that is, number one, in sort of a one-to-one comparison that you can make, these ideas of indigo and star children correspond quite closely to human fairy hybrids, which you would find throughout different folklore, where the fairies would decide to seduce a human being, and their offspring would be precocious and extremely intelligent and passionate and difficult to be around, but also incredibly artistically gifted. I mean, these are the same parameters that you find, in descriptions of indigo children. So there's that one-to-one comparison you can make, right?
Okay.
But then there's also that inverted comparison that you can make, which is this idea that there is a stranger in your home that may not be yours, and they're great, and they're super functional and they're super healthy and quite the opposite of changelings. But the other thing is that, looking at the indigo children, or especially the star children more specifically, because they're kind of the same, they're practically the same, but there are some differences you can make. Star children are oftentimes perceived of as, at least in part, hybridized, in which case the human mother and father with whom they live are the imposters, right? So I think that's a clearer sort of inversion equals representation thing. Like, there's the sensation that they have sometimes that, like, oh, these aren't my real parents that I'm living with. My real parents are in the other world. So yeah, it's sort of a little bit of flipping the concept on its head, but I think it still speaks to the same themes of alienation and whatnot.
Okay, and I don't want to forget to include your research into native folklore as well. You do have a YouTube video of a visit to a mound on your website, and
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted work that in. You have the Beaver Woman example from, I think that was from Montana. Yeah, that kind of sounds similar to the mermaid, Western European mermaid stories. So, give you some time to talk about your interests there with, the fascinating native folklore, because we our audience really enjoys those topics as well.
Oh, I absolutely love it too. I was speaking with someone the other day and saying that, once you see that there is some sort of affiliation, and I don't know how deep or how profound or how consistent it is, but once you see that there's some sort of affiliation between these topics and a lot of these indigenous sites in America, it really does sort of re-enchant the landscape around you, because you're never very far from one of these sites. I mean, America is a haunted house in that respect, to sort of paraphrase Peter Levenda. But speaking to these specific examples, and I'll sort of circle back around to my interest in the mounds here in a little bit. The Beaver women were in this specific lake in Montana, and according to Blackfoot lore, they were, the top half woman, bottom half hairy like a beaver, and they would sort of sing to women to drag them down into the depths. So again, it's that idea of, like you said, the mermaids, but also the Greek sirens as well. Mm-hmm. But they'd also take children to raise as their own underwater. And lots of times you see in European folklore that boys were sometimes favored as the ones who were abducted. Again, that speaks to sort of the values of the culture at the time. But the Beaver woman tended to appreciate young girls a little bit more for whatever reason. And then you have things like, I found it really interesting. You have little people legends throughout the United States in indigenous lore, but the Southeast is where you really find these incredibly strong correlations between little people and the things that you would see from the old world. One example from the area where I grew up were the Catawba Indians. Used to talk about the Yehasuri, who were these wild Indians who would, run around through the woods at night. And they were short. They lived underground. They ate garbage. They braided horses' manes. Like, these are all things that you could, find in fairy lore in Dorset, right, in England. It's the exact same things. And they love to abduct children. And, sometimes there are stories that these children will disappear for a week at a time. And there was actually an informant who spoke with an ethnographer in living memory, who claimed that he had been taken to a stump by the Yehasuri into the woods, and they had sucked all the blood out of his arm and, I suppose replaced it. And this is his brother who had this had happened to, and his brother returned with special abilities, and he could become basically a medicine man for the tribe. So again, we see these themes that you see in, shamanic initiation of dismemberment or some sort of disfigurement at the hands of these other beings that leads to enlightenment and the ability to do things. And where I live now, in Georgia, there are lots of roots to the Cherokee before they were forcibly evicted, and they always spoke of the Nunyanehi, who I think a good case could be made that the Nunyanehi are the strongest analog that we have in the New World to Old World fairy traditions. And the main reason that I say that is because on top of all the other similarities you find elsewhere, you also have a strong, abiding relationship between the Nunyanehi and the mounds that are here, this part of the world. Which, are often burial mounds. So it's really a one-to-one comparison that you can make between them and some of the fairies from Ireland and the British Isles. And so I'm making a point to sort of do a little bit of a video whenever I stumble across one of these sites. I did a video when I went to Ireland that, there's some stuff I've learned since then that I would sort of amend and change about what I said in that video. But the videos that I have from recent years, because the Ireland one was back in 2018 or something. But in recent years, I actually in the past year, I could say, I visited Fort Mountain, Georgia, which is the site of the Moon-Eyed people, which is sort of its own thing. But if you look at it from the right perspective, it really does sound like it's, again, yet another expression of these fairy motifs. But also the Niquosi Mound, which is in Franklin, North Carolina. It's sort of the far western tip of the state, and it's got these two real charming stories. And it's kind of sad because, I've read about Niquosi all this time, and you go there today, and it's not quite in an industrial park, but it's like definitely sandwiched between two busy thoroughfares, and there's like, some industrial buildings around, and it's like, oh, this is not as, as idyllic as I thought it might be. But it is to the town's credit, it is preserved, and Franklin is very much, it's a lovely little town, and it's right there in the heart of not only Cherokee land, but also, it's the exact same area where you find a lot of these Nunyahihe stories. And there was a story that the Nunyahihe were sort of called upon by the Cherokee, and they poured out of the mound to sort of join the ranks of the Cherokee to fight against some invaders. Again, something that is like straight out of, Irish stories, right? The idea that they would actually come out of the mound. And then that same story, apparently, I haven't really stumbled across any accounts of this, but you see this story referenced often, that that same scenario repeated itself during the American Civil War when Union forces were approaching and the town was poorly defended, so the Nunyahihe all poured out of the mound again to set up on the corners of Franklin and make it appear as if the town was well defended and the Union bypassed the city. That's the story that goes. So yeah, it's really, yeah. I love that the Nunyahihe stuff, especially. It's just such a close match. Again, we're either dealing with an objective reality or cultural contamination, and from what I've seen, it's the former rather than the latter.
Yeah, well, the native dead coming out of the mound, I actually kind of sounds like, the King Arthur legend with the once and future king, and
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
there's, and since you're talking about Georgia, Richard Thornton's been a guest with us a couple times. I don't know if you know Richard, but we did the show about all these Georgia mound sites and Cherokee villages, and looking at all the word connections that made links with Central America. Just really interesting information that you and Richard have discussed with us.
Yeah, I think that, I go into this a little bit in my newer book, but it's really interesting that you can find, all this older stuff, and it's become sort of passé to talk about window areas in regard to, Indian burial grounds, right? And some people even go so far as to say that it's offensive, and I understand that, but at the same time, I think there's something to the idea that these particular sites were often built upon places of power and might have components besides, the interment of bodies, but actual components that were incorporated into these sites to sort of serve as supernatural attractors. I think it's entirely possible if you look at sort of a tradition, yeah.
Were they built on ley lines?
Well, not only ley lines, but you look at sort of like the strata that you find in these. You can find this both in the old world and the new world. A lot of times it's, organic material, inorganic material, organic material, inorganic material. And people like Andrew Collins have talked about how this seems to be very similar to something like an orgone generator, the means of collecting, earth energy that Wilhelm Reich sort of developed. So the idea is that, and again, when Reich was working with orgone energy, he found that he was attracting UFOs. So it's like, is there something to that concept as well manifesting? So, but yeah, also the ley line idea as well, which again brings us back to everything's connected, I'm telling you. Ley lines bring us back to the wild hunt that I was mentioning earlier, and also some of those late, I believe, 1960s ideas of Ami Michel, where he talked about orthoteny and the idea of the great circles along which UFOs always traveled, which seem to sort of line up with ley lines. So it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And John Keel proposed that theory.
I think it was in Trojan Horse. Yeah, I think it was.
It's also in the Mothman prophecies, where he was kind of looking at positioning of mounds in the Point Pleasant area, and as well as up and down the Ohio River Valley, and were they on some type of ley line? It's a little difficult to be certain about it because so many have been destroyed. We don't know exactly where they stood, but he was writing about that in relation to whatever the Mothman was doing, whatever his point.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because there are a lot of people who like to bash on Keel, and I am far from that. I'm a pretty staunch supporter of Keel, while still acknowledging some of his problems. But I will say something that's always bothered me about his window area definition is that, he said, each state boasts anywhere between 2 and 10 window areas, and, it's usually a 200-mile circle, from an archaeological site at its center. And I'm thinking to myself, man, when you're on the East Coast, like, that's just a daisy chain of window areas all the way up, If you're talking about major, archaeological centers with a 200-mile radius, it's just one giant window area. So sometimes it seems a little bit non-specific, but I still think that there's something to it and I still think it was a very prescient observation that he made. Absolutely.
Yeah, he seemed to be onto something. We may not understand it as well as the people 2,000 years ago, but he was, I think he was accurate.
Yeah, I still think there's a lot of power to it, or a lot of power to the idea. Again, while still acknowledging the fact that, as I said, like, America's kind of a haunted house in its own way. Like, everybody's died somewhere, right?
Yeah. No, and let's see what. I think we're down to about 7 minutes left. Joshua, you have some upcoming appearances. It looks like.
Oh yes, yeah. If that'll be okay, I'd love to share a little bit more about them.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So the first, this is after sort of being in whatever 2020 was,
cooped up for 2 years.
Yeah, exactly.
2.5 years.
Yeah. Conferences are now finally back. So the first of these will be taking place in Missouri, in Cape Girardeau, and that is the weekend of August 5th through 7th, and it's called the Midwest Conference on the Unknown. If you just Google that, you should find it. I believe the website is Cape Events, cape-events.com, and I'll be giving a talk there, and it's an absolute knockout roster of people. Micah Hanks, Ryan Sprague, Ken Gerhard, Steve Ward, Zach Bales, Courtney Block, Margie Kay, Michael Huntington, Joel Rhodes, and myself. So it's I'm just happy to be included in those people. So that sounds like it's going to be a great time. It's actually going to be a really big conference with vendor tables and the whole 9 yards. And it looks like there's going to be a lot of time to just hang out, which is always a fun part of these conferences. Then also on a little bit more of the low-key side, the following weekend, August 11th through 14th in Franklin Grove, Illinois, I'll be attending the annual meeting of the Worldwide Metaphysical Tribe, and I'll be doing a talk on Weird Bigfoot. And it's going to be a couple of days. It's at this retreat in Illinois, and it just looks like a great time. And we're going to do CE5 and try to call down some UFOs, so we'll see what happens with that. And then finally, I will be at Dragon Con here in Atlanta. I'm not entirely sure in what capacity, so just check out the website. But that's September 1st through September 5th, 2022. I don't know. I think they have a paranormal Q&A track sort of thing. But I've been submitting. I'm like, hey, it's right around the corner. I'd like to come to Dragon Con. And this year they were finally like, yes. So that'll be that too. So I would love to see some folks there. Yeah, absolutely. In any of these places.
Okay, I hope get lots of people sitting in the seats and enjoying the speakers. Steve is one of the best.
Yeah.
We have him coming up at the end of August to discuss the upcoming Mothman Festival. Steve is just terrific. He does a great job at all the Mothman. He's a regular at those. Ken Gerhard, he's tops as well.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to meeting Steve.
Yeah, great.
And I'm Ken, and I know Micah, and I've never met Ryan. So it's just, that conference in Missouri is going to be. I saw that my name up in that company, and I was like, oh, this is going to be great. Yeah, so
that's a compliment.
Yeah, I was very very honored for sure.
Okay, and you have a new book coming out, Fairy Films.
Yeah, I've actually got, depending on the way you look at it, 3 to 5 books coming out. I have, I guess 3 to 4 books coming out. So there's the Fairy Films book, which is a collection of essays about how fairy lore have manifested itself in different films, obviously fairy films, where I'm editor and contributor of one of the essays, but the other essays are just absolutely fantastic, and they're talking about how fairy lore creeps into a lot of different movies in both subtle and not so subtle ways. And then sometime, I should imagine, in the next month, knock on wood, again, no idea when the release date of Fairy Films is, but we'll see. But sometime the next month, I should be releasing my 2-parter called Ecology of Souls, a new mythology of death and the paranormal. It's a 2-part book with a 3rd companion book, which contains some appendices that will be available for purchase as well, or it will also be available as a free download from my website because it's primarily just a book of references. But yeah, so I've got a lot of things happening soon, but all the dates are vague, with the exception of the conferences, which are nailed down.
Okay, cool. So, sounds like you've been very busy during all the lockdowns. I find a lot of our regular authors have done the same thing, letting us know, hey, got a second book of the year, coming out. Can you help promote it?
Well, it was nice because the other thing that I do is I'm a musician, and there was no there was obviously no live music happening in 2020 and most of 2021. So it was nice to have something else that I could focus on during that time. And now it seems like music's coming back. So yeah, just real busy these days.
Yep. Okay. Well, Joshua, I think we're under a minute left, and I just wanted to thank you for a fantastic show, and we'll have to do this again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on here.
Okay. Appreciate it. It was just a fantastic evening. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Barbara, for producing the show, and I think Barbara will see you with Solaris on Sunday. Take care, everyone.